So, for my physics class's final project, we had to perform an experiment of our choice. And of course, I did the logical thing, and instead of doing something simple, I decided to build a power hammer. Well, what is a power hammer? A power hammer is used in many different areas of metalworking, from smaller ones used by bladesmiths to massive ones used in foundries. Essentially, the purpose of the power hammer is instead of having some human swing a hammer to hit the steel, it's a machine that can hit a lot harder, have a lot more accuracy, and does not exhaust the metalworker. So it allows them to work longer and faster and pound out steel that they probably couldn't before. Now, typically power hammers are around $500 or more, and that's just for the cheap ones. So if I wanted to do this for my experiment, I'd have to find a cheaper design because I do not have that kind of budget. So I spent a few days scouring the internet and I found some pretty good designs, but a problem with a lot of them were either they were too expensive, I didn't have much access to those resources, or they would just be plainly too complicated to build in this short of a time. I found this one made by Young DIY though, that actually looked pretty reasonable. It was pretty cheap, it was with resources I can get my hands on, and also he used this industrial drill to power the hammer, and my dad has one of those. I originally was wanting to use a weed whacker motor, but I just couldn't find any in time, and honestly, the drill made things so much more simpler. In his design, he used a nautilus shell-shaped piece of wood attached to the drill to lift the hammer and drop it down again. By rotating the axle, the hammer would raise and abruptly drop after reaching the highest point. So the problem with his design is that because the hammer only raised up such a small amount, it wouldn't have enough force to hammer anything like steel. So what he did in his video was he used like this bigger elastic band to pull it down, but the one that he used was pretty weak. I found some industrial bands when I was shopping for materials, and I thought these would work perfect because they were really strong. These will be the variable I measure in my experiment. I originally was going to use the hammer with no bands as a control, then attach more and more bands to see how that affected it. But these bands are really strong, so I decided rather than add bands, I'd change how far they stretch. Even with one band, it would add plenty of force to be able to do the job. The rest of the materials were pretty easy to get, mostly just wood, a threaded bar to use as an axle, some metal plates/weights, some nuts, screws, and a sledgehammer. First, with my dad's help, we started on building the base and the pivot for the hammer handle. This was pretty simple. We just used a 2x4 as the base, then we measured how high the handle would be when the hammer hit the anvil, and then we built a stand and drilled a hole through it and the hammer handle so that it would pivot around a steel pole. Next step was designing the shell-shaped wheel. I'll call it the flywheel from now on. We decided it would be best if the flywheel had a drop of around 8 inches, which seemed to be a decent height. We cut it from 2 sheets of plywood and screwed them together. We then drilled a hole and put the threaded axle through it. After that, we built a stand to hold it and used 2 nuts on either side of the flywheel to keep it spaced from the sides, and added 2 more and a washer on each side on the outside of the supports. After that, we added some more pieces to make the whole thing more stable. Now, we thought to test it before we made the drill stand, and found out the flywheel would not grip to the axle and would just spin around on its own, thus not lifting the hammer. We came up with the idea to screw metal plates onto the flywheel and weld them to the bolts, so that when the bolts would turn with the axle, the screws in the metal plates would move the flywheel. I wasn't able to weld it myself, so I got a welding shop in our area to do it for me. In the meantime, we built the drill stand, which is pretty simple, and then added more supports and made sure the whole thing was structurally sound. Once we got the plates welded, we slapped everything back together and gave it a go. And this happened.
So it slipped loose.
Oh, it slipped, yeah. So let me try it again.
That was exciting.
So, one thing you might not be able to hear is my high-pitched scream as I feared of a death via a 12-pound hammer mounted on a wood ski. So we obviously have some work to do. So we maybe added like 12 more feet of bracing to the hammer because it would pound itself to pieces when we would turn it on. And Once we got all of that fixed, we turned it on and realized we made a mistake. We accidentally shaved too much off the flywheel, so the hammer would only raise a small amount before dropping down again. And also, the drill motor might just be too weak. Because of this, we had to change our idea of how we were going to experiment this. Originally, I was going to have the hammer pound spikes into a wood block, but since it only raises such a small amount, it's not going to work anymore. One thing we figured out, though, is that the rim of a 30-06 casing is hard enough that it doesn't crush under the first blow, but soft enough that the hammer makes a noticeable difference in it. So what we did to do... Wait, what's behind your ear? Oh, it's a 30-06 casing. What a coincidence. So this is pretty similar to what we used. It has nothing in it and doesn't have a primer because we don't want stuff blowing up on us when we hammer it. And they all have the same diameter, around, I think it's around 11.87 millimeters, if I'm correct. And what we would do is we would use vice grips to grab right above the shoulder and then place this part, the rim, underneath the hammer and turn it on and let it hit for around 20 strikes. One thing we also changed is that instead of stretching it farther, we just added more bands like I was going to at the beginning. And this experiment actually went pretty well. Here are some of the deformed cases that we have from the experiment, and you can see that they've actually smashed. So the first trial, we had no bands attached so that we could use it as a control, and the hammer smashed the rim from around 11.87 millimeters to 11.40 millimeters, so not that much. The second round, though, we added one band to pull the hammer down, and it smashed it from 11.87 millimeters to 11.29 millimeters, just a little more than before. Then the third round, we added two bands, and it smashed it from 11.87 millimeters to around 10.99 millimeters, or just shy of 11 millimeters. And then the fourth round, we added three bands, and it smashed it from 11.87 millimeters all the way down to 10.45 millimeters. And this is all within the same strikes. None are going more or less in their amount of strikes. So that's actually an impressive difference. Now, even though the hammer isn't super strong, it still works, and there's definitely room for improvement, I know that, but I am happy now that I have an idea of where to go. It would probably first thing be at using a better drill or a drill with variable speed, because in the video shown earlier, with the longer flywheel, the hammer would raise up, but then the drill would spin too fast and would make it like stutter in the air, so it couldn't get a full swing in. And I've seen in other designs that people use variable speed motors to even just slow down the hammer so it isn't pounding really fast. It's just bang, bang, bang. Honestly, this experiment was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot more about thinking outside of the box and using simpler mechanics to achieve more complicated goals. And it was a pretty positive experience overall, and I'm excited to see where I can take this.